How would you feel if the world discovered your diary? How would you react if your deepest, darkest secrets were suddenly at everyone's disposal? You are probably feeling a little uncomfortable right now and creating a step-by-step plan to hibernate from society for maybe a couple of decades or so. But what if I told you that writing from a place of such visceral honesty isn't just for the tortured artists out there? It is an art form that can bring you self-understanding, acceptance, even closure. If this approach to writing isn't your cup of tea, however, don't worry, you are not alone. During my sophomore year of high school, my English teacher read a poem I wrote and left a single piece of feedback. Don't make poetry your diary. But for as long as I can remember, my writing has been my diary. In fact, my first writings were scribbled in a sparkly notebook my mother and I picked up at the Justice store with my first initial E on the front cover. That book saw some of my deepest ruminations to date, ranging from fickle middle school friendship breakups and stories about superheroes with a shared love of avant-garde fashion, to not so fickle hopes and dreams for my future. Even as I developed as a writer throughout high school, my titles began getting increasingly personal and diary-like. Take, for example, Google Photos memory of girl who did not want to have her picture taken, peeling shrimp because my mind is a crustacean, and my personal favorite, hey blank, thanks for killing me. The problem for me is that my sophomore English teacher isn't alone. Many teachers, critics, and institutions have varying opinions on the level of trauma dumping that is acceptable in art. But I want to challenge this notion. I believe that putting yourself into your writing is a way to allow your audience and you to respond to your art with care, with affection, with grace. I learned this at a young age. When I was in the 6th grade, I submitted 2 poems to The New Yorker about my family vacation to Hawaii. I wrote a whole cover letter, as you can see, and told them why I believed I was a perfect fit for their magazine. Though I was completely rejected, I also received the most beautiful rejection letter of all time, which, let me tell you, as a more tenured writer now, that is not something The New Yorker typically does. Isn't that like the nicest rejection? When I first submitted my poems, I burdened myself with the expectation of perfection. After receiving my rejection, I was finally introduced to the idea that writing to impress was ironically less impressive than writing to understand. So I revisit this letter whenever I feel like I need a bit of a nudge to stay true to my values of authenticity. Although disappointment is a natural byproduct of the creative journey, so is appreciation of the process itself, which is inevitably a long and hard one. Writing from this perspective instead is what has allowed me to heal and achieve a greater understanding of my emotions, experiences, and decisions. Thank you so much, Kevin Young from The New Yorker. You really helped. As the daughter of Chinese immigrant parents, who also happens to be a chronic oversharer, I know all too well the struggle many young artists face when towing the line between sharing our innermost thoughts and keeping up some veil of privacy. So 4 years ago, I created a space for young writers and artists to feel comfortable enough to overshare, called Synthesis Publications. Synthesis is an online magazine I created in my bedroom before the beginning of high school during the COVID-19 pandemic. From building the website to receiving hundreds of submissions since then, we've embraced writers and artists on our staff who break convention, are self-referential, are meta, and are most of all true to themselves. Clearly, people need to share. People need to feel understood, and I know this because we've accrued over 500,000 impressions across social media and on our website, in addition to thousands of comments, direct messages, and emails with strangers all across the internet asking if they could have their story uploaded to our platform. There is my proof that people need a space to be confessional and comfortable in their own skin. Even after establishing this community of young writers and artists like myself, I still crave the validation of elite summer writing programs, fellowships, and publications whose conventional standards I felt like I could never meet. I twisted myself into knots, wondering whether my writing was detailed enough, but yet still discreet enough to present me in a desirable light. In my applications to these programs and magazines, I refrained from jumping into the minutia of my memories and emotions as to not come across as too intense or overwhelming. But during a workshop the summer before my sophomore year of high school, a poetry instructor pushed back on the idea that masking emotions is a stronger approach to writing. He noticed a line in a poem of mine where I was writing around what I was meaning to say, a common habit of many young writers of color whose experiences might be just a bit too visceral to express directly. He told me that the true fruit of my art was buried beneath all of the euphemism and complex imagery I utilized. His critiques enlightened me to the concept of writing not just being a series of techniques or a measure of craft, but more so a catharsis. There's a word for this style of writing, which favors vulnerability rather than poise: confessionalism. Life isn't pretty, so why should art have to be? Many of the literary greats that we know of today turn to confessional writing. We have Emily Dickinson, Robert Lowell, Sylvia Plath, Anne Sexton, and one of the greatest and most prolific writers of our generation, Taylor Swift. All of these writers created remarkable work from the private, writing for their own eyes to the enjoyment of an audience. Equally as compelling as the poetry itself is how these writers were able to portray their personal lives into their work, resonating with the general public. Let's take Emily Dickinson, for example, who lived and wrote in seclusion, away from the external expectations of literary critics of her time. She wrote poems and bound them into small booklets called fascicles that she stowed away safely, or so she thought, in a chest. After she died, Emily had these diaries, her most private musings, ripped out of her possession and into the hands of readers for centuries to come. Robert Lowell was another notable confessional poet who turned to confessional writing as a way to funnel his ambitious reflection. He wrote about his criticisms of war and his transition from Protestantism to Catholicism, so much so that he is said to have been the inspiration behind the entire genre of confessional writing itself. Although these writers have been rightfully praised, they have also been ruthlessly scrutinized, given that it had become harder and harder for readers to discern the art from the artist. Much of this criticism has fallen on female artists. Female confessional poets are expected by many to write as close and as true to their personal lives as possible, yet are reprimanded if they go beyond what makes the general audience comfortable. We can see this in the reception of Sylvia Plath, who was exceptionally candid in her work and had garnered a reputation for being the quintessential sad girl. Many still don't view Sylvia Plath through a critical literary lens, but instead through a diluted misinterpretation of her persona as a tragic figure. To this day, Plath's legacy is reduced to spectacle and the study of the tortured woman, rather than a feat of the truthful depiction of womanhood and personal struggles. In my own poetry, I've talked at length about many girlish and womanly subjects, whether I'm complaining about this emotional roller coaster called my period, you might have heard of it, or I'm going on and on about having to fit into the perfect Asian American daughter archetype. But the intention behind bringing up these topics and others derived from my day-to-day life is not to honesty alone, but to close the gap between my persona and personhood. Too many of us present a facade to the world, shutting out the qualities that make us so beautifully distinct from each other. Confessional writing is a way for all of us to return to form, a version of ourselves that is unburdened by FOMO, judgment, fake smiles, or a role we have to play. And when we can portray ourselves authentically in our work, we find that those who engage with it have an easier time accepting their true identities too. I find confessional writing to be a way to turn the tale of being overdramatic on its head, to share an insight through transparency, plain and simple. Confession is able to warrant empathy. Before hearing my poetry instructor's remarks about how I was writing around what I was meaning to say, I thought confessionalism weighed my work down. Now I realized it has accomplished the completely opposite effect. The good writing in me naturally transfers from my fingers to the keyboard in instances of cataclysmic doubt, unbridled anger, a minor inconvenience. I don't write too often when I'm elated, but let's save that for another talk. If you really think about it, writing is the art of talking to yourself outside of your own thoughts. Don't be ashamed of the intensity in what you write, because trust me, there is someone out there who has written something equally, if not far more dramatic. Let's take a look at Sylvia Plath's poem, Lady Lazarus, in which she writes, "Dying is an art like everything else. I do it exceptionally well." The beauty of confessionalism is that it invites artists to be too honest, too vulnerable, too wounded, too much. When you have no one else to turn to, you still do have a method of turning to yourself, even if that means staring at a blinking cursor for hours on end. And I am, of course, not talking from personal experience. Recently, I wrote a poem lamenting the death of my grandmother. Finally, putting into words what took me months to express allowed me to reckon with the fact that I will never see her again in this life, yet I know she is still somewhere out there, invisible to the mortal eye, cheering me on. I titled this poem 4, referencing that when my grandmother passed, my 4 stewards became 3. As my 4 stewards became 3, you count the measures of my brother's humbling silence over the phone. I say she flew home. The hindsight left behind was her gift, your permission for Nenai to go. With my mother, my father, my brother Eric, and my grandmother, I have been stewarded well. I have always been the high-maintenance baby of the family who looked up to her adult companions for advice and solace. After my mother, my grandmother was the first to hold me in her arms after I was born. She watched me grow up from our old house a few towns over, learn to understand my broken Mandarin, greeted me with fresh snacks every day after school, and demonstrated so many other acts of kindness I've tried to replicate in my own life in her example. Writing about this experience gave what I thought was once fleeting a new forever, and closure that is so often elusive. As a writer, I am frequently asked this one question: how do you just sit down and write? It's hard for me to answer this question, not because I don't know how to accomplish it for myself, but because I don't know how to tell others that you simply just have to accept the slew of bad writing that comes before the good. When we forbid ourselves from messing up, we hit a wall. We draw blanks, we lose motivation to create, we feel extremely guilty about not creating, we cave and try to start again but can't, and the cycle continues. After receiving hundreds of rejections from publications and opportunities, I realized that anyone who expects a reward for their writing will never truly enjoy it. And the more I have been exposed to the deepest, darkest secrets of writers who were applauded rather than dissented for their confessions, the more confident I feel with inserting myself into my writing too. What makes writing good isn't necessarily the content itself, but how the content is portrayed, with conviction, heart, meaning, and truth. I'm not going to stand here today and say that everyone here is seeking to become a successful writer. Why? Because that would go against a key tenet of my talk today: honesty. What I will say is that it is easier to write if you feel like you have a reason to. And I cannot think of a better inclination than to unpack all of the incredibleness and weirdness, and maybe, for some of us, traumaticness that is you. So what can confessional writing do for you? Well, you need to understand you first. Remember, you are the only person in the world who can give yourself closure. Confessional writing is a tool that provides clarity and a sense of belonging because you are encouraged to write from the heart without shame, doubt, or fear. Writing is how I find acceptance with myself and the way things are. Maybe it's high time for you to pick your middle school diary back up and follow your own example. Thank you.